Wait, you didn't even call Emily after the wedding? Jason's voice came through my phone in that casual way people use when they assume the answer is obvious. I was standing in the kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. "What wedding?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a long one, just long enough to feel wrong. "The wedding," Jason said again. 2 weeks ago. Emily's." I remember staring out the window over the sink, watching a car pass slowly down the street like the world hadn't just tilted sideways. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said quietly. "Emily's wedding isn't for another few months." Another pause. Then Jason laughed a little, the way people do when they think you're joking. "Dan, what are you talking about?"
It already happened. I didn't answer right away. My mind was doing that strange thing where it tries to correct reality instead of accepting it. "That's not possible," I said.
"Why not?"
"Because I would have been there."
This time, the silence on Jason's end stretched longer. "You got the invitation," he said finally. It wasn't a question. I leaned against the counter. "No," I said. Another silence. "You're saying you never got it?" "No." Jason exhaled through the phone. "Well, that's weird." Weird. That was the word he chose. Not alarming, not concerning, just weird. "Where was it?" I asked. "The wedding? At that vineyard outside Sacramento. Emily's been planning it for almost a year." I felt something shift slowly inside my chest. Almost a year. "Jason," I said, keeping my voice steady.
"You're telling me our sister got married 2 weeks ago, and I'm hearing about it now?"
"Well, yeah," he said carefully. "I thought you were just doing your thing."
"My thing?"
"You travel a lot. I figured you had a project or something."
"I run an architecture firm," I said, "not a spy agency." Jason let out a small laugh again, but it sounded thinner this time.
"Well, Emily said the invitation went out months ago."
I set the mug down on the counter. "Did you see it?" I asked.
"See what?"
"My invitation." Another pause.
"No," he admitted. "Why would I?"
"Exactly." I could hear Jason shifting around on the other end of the phone.
"Look," he said, "maybe it got lost in the mail or something."
Maybe. That was the second word people use when they don't want to look too closely at something.
"I guess," I said. "Yeah," Jason replied quickly. "Stuff happens."
Stuff happens. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. "Sure," I said. A few seconds passed, then Jason added, almost like an afterthought.
"Anyway, Emily was wondering why you didn't call."
I let out a quiet breath. "That's interesting."
"Why?"
"Because this is the first time anyone has mentioned a wedding to me." Jason didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said something that would stay with me long after the call ended. "Huh." Just that. Huh. Like the whole situation was a puzzle someone had accidentally dropped on the floor.
"Well," he said eventually, "you should probably talk to Emily."
"Yeah," I said. "I probably should." When we hung up, I stayed there in the kitchen for a while, not moving, just staring at the coffee mug. Because part of me was still waiting for the obvious explanation to show up. Something simple. A misunderstanding. A scheduling change. An email I'd somehow missed. Something that would turn this into a normal mistake instead of whatever it actually was. But the truth was already sitting quietly in the room. Emily had gotten married. My brother had been there. My mother had been there.
Extended family had been there. And no one had called me. No one had texted. No one had said, "Hey Dan, where are you?" That thought settled slowly into my chest, and the longer I stood there, the heavier it felt. Rachel found me about 10 minutes later. She walked into the kitchen, still wearing her running shoes, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "You okay?" she asked. I looked up. "Do you remember Emily's wedding date?" Rachel frowned slightly. "I thought it was in the fall." "So did I." She leaned against the counter. "Why?" I hesitated. Then I said, "Apparently, it already happened." Rachel blinked. "What?" "2 weeks ago." Her eyebrows pulled together. "That doesn't make any sense. Jason says invitations went out months ago. And you didn't get one?" "No." Rachel crossed her arms. "Did Emily say anything about changing the date?" "No." Rachel studied my face for a moment. "You're serious?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said something very calmly. "That doesn't feel like a mailing error." I didn't respond. Rachel had a way of saying things directly that I usually tried to smooth over. "Maybe it was," I said. "Maybe." But the way she said it told me she didn't believe that any more than I did. Rachel had been around my family for almost 8 years, long enough to notice patterns I preferred not to see. "You should call your mom," she said. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I probably should." I waited another 20 minutes before I did. Not because I was afraid of the conversation, at least that's what I told myself. In reality, I think I already suspected what the answers might sound like. My mother picked up on the 3rd ring. "Danny," she said brightly. "How are you?" Danny. She was the only person who still called me that. "I'm good," I said. "How are you?" "Oh, you know, same as always." Her voice sounded normal, relaxed, like nothing unusual had happened recently. "Jason called earlier," I said. "Oh?" "He mentioned Emily's wedding." The line went quiet. Not silent, just careful. "Oh," my mother said finally. "Yes." I leaned against the counter again. "Apparently it happened 2 weeks ago." "Yes," she said. Another pause. "It was lovely." Lovely. That word landed softly, like a photograph placed face down on a table. "Mom," I said, "I never got an invitation." She didn't answer immediately. "Well," she said eventually, "Emily sent them out herself." "So I've heard. She spent a lot of time organizing everything." "I'm sure she did." The conversation was drifting into that polite territory where everyone pretends the obvious thing isn't sitting in the middle of the room. "Did you know I didn't get one?" I asked. That question created a longer pause. "I assumed you did," my mother said. "You assumed?" "Yes." "And when I didn't show up?" "Well, we thought maybe you were busy." Busy. Another familiar word. "I'm your son," I said quietly. "Yes, of course you are." "And I didn't show up to my sister's wedding." "Yes." "And no one thought to call me." There was a subtle shift in her voice. "Daniel, I didn't want to bother you if you had work obligations." "I didn't." "Well, we didn't know that." I let that sit there for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming since Jason's call. "Did Emily ask you not to mention it to me?" "No," my mother said quickly. Too quickly. "Of course not." I nodded slowly. "Okay." "She said she mailed the invitations," my mother added.
Sometimes things get lost. Yes, I said. Sometimes they do. We ended the call a few minutes later with the same polite tone we'd started with. Nothing was resolved. Nothing was acknowledged. The entire conversation existed inside that careful space families create when no one wants to admit what's happening. Rachel was sitting at the dining table when I came back into the room. She watched my face for a second. "Well?" she asked. "They mailed it," I said. "Of course they did." "Apparently, sometimes things get lost." Rachel tilted her head slightly. "And no one called when you didn't show up?" "No." She leaned back in her chair. "That's impressive." "Impressive?" "In a logistical sense," she said calmly. "That's a lot of people managing not to notice you missing from a wedding." I almost smiled. Rachel had a dry way of putting things that cut straight through the fog. "It was probably just a misunderstanding," I said. Rachel didn't respond. Instead, she reached over and picked up her phone. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Looking something up." A few seconds passed, then she turned the screen toward me. Emily's wedding photos had already made their way onto social media. The vineyard looked beautiful. Late afternoon sunlight, rows of white chairs, a wooden arch covered in flowers. Emily standing in the center of it all in a long, ivory dress. Jason beside her in a dark suit. My mother sitting in the front row. Smiling. Rachel scrolled slowly through the photos. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. Relatives I recognized. Cousins. Old family friends. People who had known me for decades. None of them looked confused. None of them looked like they were wondering where I was. I studied one photo in particular. Emily and Jason standing beside our mother during the reception. All three of them laughing at something someone had just said. Rachel lowered the phone. "Did anyone text you that day?" she asked. "No." "Call?" "No." She nodded slowly. "That's interesting." "Yeah," I said quietly. "It is." Rachel didn't push the conversation further. She rarely did. Instead, she said something simple. "You should talk to Emily." I looked back down at the photo on the screen, my sister standing under a flower-covered arch, smiling like everything in the world was exactly the way she wanted it. "Yeah," I said. "I think I will." But I didn't call her that night. Not because I was angry. Not yet. What I felt instead was something stranger. A quiet sense that the ground under a very old story had just shifted slightly, and I wasn't sure what I was standing on anymore. I called Emily the next morning at 9:14. I remember the exact time because I stood there looking at her name on my phone for almost a full minute before I hit call, like there might still be some version of this that would make sense if I waited long enough. She answered on the fourth ring. "Hey," she said. Not warm, not cold, just flat. "Hey," I said. "Do you have a minute?" A pause. "Sure." I stood in my office with one hand in my pocket, staring at the framed site plan on the wall across from my desk. "Jason told me about the wedding." Another pause, shorter this time. "Okay." "I didn't know it happened." "We mailed the invitation," she said immediately. No surprise, no concern. Just the sentence itself, ready to go like she'd already said it in her head before I called. "I know that's the official version," I said. "What I'm asking is whether you knew I never got it." Her tone tightened. "Daniel, I'm not doing this." "Doing what?" "This thing where you turn everything into an accusation." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so clean. We were less than 30 seconds into the conversation, and somehow I was already the difficult one. "I'm not accusing you of anything," I said. "I'm asking you a direct question." "We sent the invitations. If yours got lost, I can't help that." "And when I didn't show up?" Another pause. "We figured you made a choice." "A choice based on what?" Emily exhaled into the phone. "Based on you, Daniel." That landed harder than I expected. "What does that mean?" "It means you've always kept one foot out of this family and then acted hurt when people stopped chasing you." I looked down at the floor. That was new. Not the criticism itself. My family had always had ways of making my distance sound self-created. But the confidence in it was new. The smoothness. "I kept one foot out?" I repeated. "Yes." "Emily, I paid Mom's mortgage for almost 2 years after Dad died." "That's not what I'm talking about." "I paid for Jason's last year of college." "That's not what I'm talking about either." "I co-signed your first apartment lease." Her voice sharpened. "Exactly." I frowned. "Exactly what?" "You always do that." "Do what?" "You make a list." It took me a second to answer because I genuinely hadn't expected that. "I'm not making a list," I said. "I'm reminding you I've shown up." "No," she said. "You've provided things. That's not the same." The words sat there between us. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I had the strange sensation of having walked into a room I'd spent years paying for and being told I'd never actually lived there. "What would showing up have looked like to you?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe not acting like you're everybody's emergency contact and final authority." "I have never acted like the final authority." Emily let out a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Okay. There was enough history inside that one word to fill an afternoon." "When did you decide not to tell me the wedding date had changed?" I asked. "I didn't decide that." "Then how did it happen?" "Things were hectic." "That's not an answer." "I was planning a wedding. And I'm your brother." "Yes. And I found out 2 weeks after it happened." "I know." There it was. Not shock, not regret, just, "I know." I closed my eyes for a second. "So you did know." She was quiet. "I knew there had been tension," she said carefully. "Tension?" "Yes." "What kind of tension?" "The kind where every family event becomes about whether you approve of how it's being handled." My grip tightened on the phone. "I didn't even know there was a date." "You always know more than you say." That sentence stayed with me. It didn't even make sense on the surface, but emotionally it told me a lot. Emily wasn't talking about the invitation anymore. She was talking about a role. About who she believed I was in this family. Maybe who she needed me to be so the story would work. "I'm going to ask one more time," I said. "Did you want me there?" Emily didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice had gone very calm. "I wanted a peaceful wedding." Then she said she had another call, and the conversation ended there. I stood in my office long after the line went dead, not angry, not even shocked anymore, just stripped down in a way I hadn't expected. I wanted a peaceful wedding. Not "I'm sorry," not "I wish this had gone differently." Just a sentence that translated cleanly if you didn't look away from it. My presence was considered a risk. That afternoon, I got through exactly 23 minutes of actual work. I revised a site elevation, sent 2 emails, opened the same budget sheet 3 times without reading it. Then I gave up and drove over to my mother's house. I hadn't told her I was coming. That used to be normal. Lately, it felt like dropping in on a place that still looked like home but no longer operated that way. She opened the door wearing a cardigan I'd seen 100 times, the pale blue one with the missing button near the bottom. "Daniel," she said, startled. "I didn't know you were coming." "I know." She stepped aside and let me in. The house smelled like coffee and laundry detergent, same as always. For a second, that almost made things worse. Familiar places have a way of offering comfort at the exact moment they stop being honest. My mother led me into the kitchen. She moved with that careful energy people use when they're trying not to set something off. "Do you want coffee?" she asked. "No." She nodded and sat down at the table. I stayed standing for a moment, then took the chair across from her. "I talked to Emily," I said. My mother folded her hands. "I see." She said she wanted a peaceful wedding. Margaret looked down at the table. "Emily was under a lot of stress." "So was I said. "I just didn't know there was a wedding." My mother gave me a tired look. "Daniel." "No, Mom. I'm done with the soft version." That got her attention. I almost never spoke to her that way. Not because I was especially patient, but because somewhere along the line I had taken on the job of making hard conversations easier for everyone else. "Did she want me invited?" I asked. My mother didn't answer. I waited. She adjusted her hands slightly, one thumb sliding over the other. "Mom." "She wasn't sure," she said. The room got very still. "Wasn't sure," I repeated. "She said she didn't want unnecessary tension." "From me?" "She worried things might become complicated." I let out a quiet breath. Complicated for who? Margaret looked up at me then, and for the first time there was something close to honesty in her face. "For everyone." I leaned back in my chair. There it was. Not the whole truth, probably, but enough of it. "She didn't know how to handle it," my mother said. "She thought mailing the invitation was the neutral option." I stared at her. The neutral option. Yes. She gets to tell herself she invited me, and if I don't show up, it becomes my fault. My mother winced slightly. "It wasn't meant that way." "Then what was it meant to do?" "She was trying to avoid conflict." I nodded once. "By avoiding me." Margaret looked exhausted. "You and Emily have had tension for years." "I didn't know that tension justified disappearing me from her wedding." "She didn't disappear you." I held her gaze. "Then why did no one call?" That question sat heavily between us. My mother didn't answer, and that was answer enough. When people don't call, it's rarely because they forgot. It's because at some point, consciously or not, a group decision formed around silence. "I need you to say it clearly," I said. Margaret frowned. "Say what?" "That you all knew I wasn't there." "Of course we knew." "That you knew I hadn't arrived." "Yes." "That you knew nobody had heard from me." She looked away. "Yes." "And nobody called." She pressed her lips together. "We thought—" She stopped. "What?" "We thought if you wanted to explain it, you would." I stared at her. Explain it? As if I were the one who had failed some obligation. As if I had chosen absence and then neglected to provide a proper memo. I nodded slowly, because anger was there now, but it had gone cold. Cold enough to think. "I think that's the part I needed to understand," I said. "Daniel, please don't make this bigger than it is." I looked at her for a long moment. "Mom," I said quietly, "you let your daughter get married without checking why your son wasn't there." Her eyes filled immediately, but not with the kind of tears that change anything. They were defensive tears, frightened tears, tears that show up when the truth sounds too sharp in the room. "It wasn't like that." It was exactly like that. No, her voice trembled. You don't understand how hard things have been. I almost asked the obvious question, hard for whom? But I didn't. I was starting to understand that asking better questions wasn't the problem. My family had answers. They just preferred the versions that kept everybody comfortable. My mother straightened slightly and reached for a safer road. Emily has always felt judged by you. There it was again. Judged. That word had become a container in my family. You could pour almost anything into it. Boundaries, suggestions, financial caution, not agreeing fast enough, not pretending. How? I asked. Margaret hesitated. She said you always act like you know what's best. I usually got called when something went wrong. That's not the same thing. No, I said. It isn't. She softened her voice. You're the oldest. You took on a lot after your father died. Maybe too much. That part, at least, was true. My dad died of a stroke when I was 26. One ordinary Tuesday morning, he was at the kitchen table complaining about insurance paperwork, and by Thursday we were sorting through funeral flowers and casseroles and bank statements no one knew how to read. Jason was 19. Emily was 17. My mother had never handled the finances alone. Dad had done all of it. Mortgage, taxes, accounts, insurance, repairs. And overnight, every adult conversation in the house started turning toward me. I didn't decide to become the responsible one. There was just a week where the lights still needed to stay on, Jason still needed tuition, Emily still needed senior year fees, and my mother kept staring at envelopes like they were written in another language. So I stepped in. At first, I told myself it was temporary. I covered the mortgage when the life insurance payout got delayed. I took over the utility bills. I drove Jason to campus orientation because my mother couldn't stop crying long enough to get through the day. I met with Emily's school counselor when she started slipping in class because nobody else could make the meeting during work hours. And then, temporary became the shape of things. No one said, Daniel, this is your job now. They didn't need to. Families don't always assign roles out loud. Sometimes they just keep handing you the same weight until everybody forgets you were ever carrying it voluntarily. Back in the kitchen, my mother was still talking, quieter now. You've always been solid, she said. People leaned on you. I looked at her. And that made them resent me? No, she said quickly, not resent. What word would you prefer? She rubbed her temple. I think sometimes Emily felt small around you. That sentence would have made more sense if I'd spent my life humiliating her, but I hadn't. If anything, I had spent years translating things into gentler versions so she wouldn't feel cornered. When she wanted to move into her first apartment at 23 and the landlord hesitated because of her credit, I was the one who co-signed. When she got laid off from the dental office and didn't tell Mom for 3 weeks, I was the one who quietly sent money so she could stay caught up on rent. When she wanted to start that online stationery business and had no budget, I paid for the first inventory order and told her to pay me back only if it took off. It never did. I never brought it up again. I wasn't saying any of this to make myself look noble. By this point, I was beginning to see the other side of it. Help, if repeated long enough, can become its own structure. The person receiving it doesn't always experience it as generosity. Sometimes they experience it as evidence that you had power in the room, even when you weren't trying to. But even knowing that, I couldn't make this make sense. There was a difference between feeling complicated around someone and quietly cutting them out of your wedding. My mother looked exhausted. Can't you just talk to her again when everyone's calmer? The old version of me would have said yes. He would have left the kitchen with a smaller, more manageable explanation in hand. Stress, miscommunication, old tensions, bad timing. Instead, I heard myself say, "No." My mother blinked. "No? No. I'm not going to chase a cleaner version of this so everybody can feel better." She looked genuinely unsettled by that. It unsettled me too. Because underneath the anger, another feeling was beginning to take shape. Not just hurt, recognition. The whole family had built itself around a quiet arrangement. I handled practical things. I stabilized what needed stabilizing. I took the late calls, the hard talks, the financial emergencies, the forms, the repairs, the decisions no one else wanted. And in return, I got a title. Reliable. Solid. The one we can count on. What I did not get, apparently, was unconditional inclusion. That night, Rachel and I ate takeout at the dining table because neither of us felt like cooking. The food got cold while I talked in circles for 20 minutes, trying to explain something I was only starting to understand myself. Rachel listened without interrupting. When I finally stopped, she set her fork down. "So let me see if I have this right," she said. "Your sister didn't want the discomfort of dealing with you directly, so she created plausible deniability. Your mom went along with it because silence felt easier than conflict. Your brother accepted whatever version was circulating because that's what he always does." I nodded. Rachel looked at me steadily. "And now everybody wants you to process that in a way that protects them from the meaning of it." I looked down at my plate. "Yeah." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "There's something I think you don't want to say." I let out a breath. "What?" "That this only worked because on some level they believed you'd absorb it." I didn't answer. Rachel didn't push. She never pushed when she'd already hit the center of something. "You've been cushioning this family for a long time," she said. "Financially, emotionally, practically. People get used to a cushion. After a while, they stop noticing it's there. They only notice when it's gone." That sat with me the rest of the night. Maybe that's why stories inside families are so hard to understand while you're living them. Everyone's role starts to feel natural, even when it isn't. The person who accommodates becomes the calm one. The person who avoids becomes sensitive. The person who takes becomes overwhelmed. The person who notices patterns becomes critical. And if you live inside those labels long enough, you stop asking who benefits from them. Sometimes people only recognize the shape of a family once they've been placed outside of it long enough to see what role they were really playing. I didn't sleep much. Around 6 in the morning, I got a text from Aunt Carol. "Heard you and Emily still haven't spoken properly. Call me when you can." I stared at the message for a while before I called. Aunt Carol was my mother's younger sister, which meant she had spent most of her life orbiting the exact same emotional weather system while somehow staying just far enough outside it to describe what she saw. She answered on the second ring. "Daniel?" "Hi, Aunt Carol." Her voice softened. "I was wondering when you'd call." "You heard about the wedding conversation?" "I heard enough." I leaned back in my desk chair and rubbed my eyes. "Did you know I wasn't invited?" There was a pause. "I knew something was off," she said. "Meaning?" "Meaning Emily told people you had a work conflict." I sat up straighter. "She told people that?" "Yes." I stared at the wall. "When?" "Before the wedding, maybe a couple of weeks before. Someone asked if you were coming to the rehearsal dinner, and Emily said you were tied up with a project and probably couldn't make it." I didn't speak, because there it was. Not a missing envelope, not a simple oversight. A prepared explanation. "She said that to multiple people?" I asked. "As far as I know, yes." I looked out the window of my office at the parking lot below.
A few people were heading into the building next door with coffees in hand, moving through a completely normal Thursday morning.
She expected me not to be there, I said. Aunt Carol let out a slow breath. That was my impression. I closed my eyes. And nobody thought that was strange? Oh, I think some people did. But by then it had been framed as settled. You know how your family is. Once a story starts circulating, people prefer to stand near it rather than question it. That sentence hit with almost surgical precision. Stand near it rather than question it. Yes, I said quietly. I do know how they are. Carol's voice softened more. For what it's worth, I did think about calling you. Why didn't you? She answered honestly, which I appreciated even though it hurt. Because I thought if you didn't want to talk about it, I shouldn't pry.
And because your mother sounded like everything had been worked out. Worked out. Another phrase that meant nothing and covered everything. Aunt Carol, I said, can I ask you something directly?
Of course.
Has Emily always felt this way about me? Carol was silent for a moment. Then she said, I think Emily's had two feelings about you for a long time, and she's never known how to separate them. What two feelings? She trusts you, and she resents needing to. That answer sat so cleanly in the middle of everything that I couldn't say anything for a moment. Not because it was dramatic, because it was believable. Believable was worse. After my call with Aunt Carol, I sat in my office for a long time without doing anything. Not scrolling my phone, not opening email, just sitting there with my hands folded on the desk, staring at the thin crack running along the corner of the drywall across from me. Carol's sentence kept repeating in my head. She trusts you, and she resents needing to. It explained more than I wanted it to. For years, I had assumed that responsibility and closeness traveled together. If you were the one people depended on, it meant you were valued. It meant you were included. It meant you were part of the structure in a way that couldn't be quietly erased. But that wasn't actually how families worked. Sometimes the person who stabilizes everything becomes the background of the picture instead of a person inside it. Reliable things become infrastructure, necessary but not always welcomed. And when people start building their independence, the first thing they often want distance from is the thing that made them feel dependent, even if that thing was trying to help. That realization didn't make Emily's decision feel fair, but it made it understandable in a way that complicated the anger. I finished my workday without speaking to anyone else in the family. For the first time since Jason's call, the situation felt strangely quiet. Like a storm had already passed, and now the damage was visible, but nobody was running around yelling about it anymore. Just after dinner that evening, my phone buzzed. Emily. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. Hey, I said. Her voice sounded cautious. Hi. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Finally, she said, Mom told me you went over there. I did. And you talked? Yes. Another pause. I didn't want things to get like this, she said. I leaned back in my chair. Like what? Complicated. That seems to be your main concern. Emily sighed. You're doing it again. Doing what? Turning everything into a debate. I'm asking questions. You're interrogating me. I rubbed my forehead. Emily, you got married without telling me. I mailed the invitation. That's not the same thing. You're acting like I banned you from the building. You told people I had a work conflict. Silence. Longer this time. Who told you that? She asked. Aunt Carol? Emily muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite hear. So what if I said that? She replied. That means you expected me not to be there.
It meant I expected a situation.
What situation?
The one where you show up with opinions about everything. I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming since yesterday. Emily, do you think I wanted control over your wedding? I think you always want control. That's not true. You don't even hear yourself, she said. Her voice had grown sharper now. You're the guy who fixes everything. You're the guy who pays for everything. You're the guy who tells people the responsible choice. Do you have any idea what that feels like to be around your whole life? I was quiet, because suddenly I did. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to understand that the story inside her head had probably been building for years. Did I ever tell you what you were allowed to do? I asked. No. Did I stop you from anything? No. Then where was the control? It's the way you look at things, she said. The way you decide what makes sense. That's called having an opinion. That's called making everyone feel like they need your approval. I stared at the ceiling. There are moments in arguments when you realize you're not actually talking about the current event anymore. You're talking about 10 years of unspoken reactions, and suddenly every small moment gets interpreted through a new lens. I never asked for that role, I said quietly. Maybe not, Emily replied, but you took it. Her words didn't sound angry anymore, just tired. And the wedding, she continued, was the first thing in my life where I didn't want to feel like someone else was supervising the outcome. That sentence landed differently than the others, because it wasn't defensive. It was honest. And the solution, I said slowly, was to pretend I'd been invited. I didn't pretend. You created a situation where you didn't have to deal with me. Emily didn't respond. Finally, she said, I thought if you didn't come, it meant you were okay with it. I let out a quiet breath. You thought my silence meant consent. Yes. I didn't know there was a situation to consent to. Another silence settled between us. Then Emily said something I hadn't expected.
I didn't think you'd care this much.
I laughed softly. Emily, I found out my sister got married 2 weeks after it happened. I know. And no one called. I know. And you're surprised that matters? I just thought... She trailed off. What? That you had your own life. That sentence revealed more than anything else she had said. My own life. In other words, outside the family system, a place where my absence wouldn't disrupt the picture. I realized something then that felt both sad and clarifying. For years, I had believed my involvement held the family together. But from Emily's perspective, my involvement was something the family could occasionally step away from, like taking a break from a structure that felt too heavy. Okay, I said quietly. Emily hesitated.
That's it?
Yes.
You're not going to argue?
No.
That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have.
Well, what does that mean? She asked.
It means I understand your position.
And
now I'm going to adjust mine. The line went quiet.
Daniel,
I'm not angry, I said, which was true. Anger had already passed through and left something cleaner behind.
Then what are you?
She asked. Clear. We ended the call shortly after that. Not with a resolution, not with an apology, just with a quiet recognition that the shape of our relationship had changed. Rachel was reading on the couch when I came into the living room. She glanced up. That sounded calmer.
It was.
Did you get answers?
Yes.
Do you feel better?
I sat down across from her. In a way. Rachel waited.
She didn't want me there, I said. Rachel nodded slowly.
That was my guess. She thought I'd create tension. Rachel studied my face. And do you think you would have? No. But she believed you would. Yes. Rachel closed her book. Sometimes people don't react to who you are. They react to the version of you that exists in their head. I leaned back against the couch. That seems accurate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most. So what are you going to do? For years, that question would have had one answer. Repair it, smooth it over, offer some compromise that allowed the system to keep running without anyone needing to acknowledge the deeper imbalance. But the wedding had done something unexpected.
It had shown me what the system looked like without me inside it. And everyone had been comfortable enough with that version to let it happen. I'm going to stop pretending my role in this family is what I thought it was, I said. Rachel didn't speak. I continued. For a long time, I've had a shared investment account that quietly covers a few things. Mom's property tax shortfalls, emergency expenses, the occasional help when Jason or Emily run into trouble. Rachel nodded. I know. They've come to expect it. Yes. I looked out the window. And I've never said anything about it, because I told myself that's what family does. Rachel's voice was gentle. And now? Now I think family is also supposed to include you. She didn't argue with that. The next morning I called my financial advisor. It wasn't a dramatic conversation, just paperwork, a few signatures, some account restructuring. By the end of the week, the shared structure I had maintained for years no longer existed. The funds were still there, but they were entirely under my control now. No quiet safety net, no automatic access, no assumption that the person who stabilized things would always continue doing so. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. 2 weeks later, my mother called. Her voice sounded careful. Daniel, I noticed the investment account looks different. Yes? You moved things. I reorganized them. She hesitated. Does that mean... It means the arrangement we had before isn't in place anymore. Silence filled the line. Finally, she asked the question that mattered most. Why? I thought about a dozen possible answers, but the real one was simpler. Because I realized something, I said. What? For years, I thought being responsible for the family also meant being part of it. My mother didn't reply. I'm still here, I continued calmly, but the structure is different now. Her voice sounded small. Emily didn't mean to hurt you. I believe that. But you're changing everything. No, I said quietly. It already changed. The wedding had simply made it visible. Months passed after that. There were fewer calls, fewer assumptions, fewer quiet expectations. The distance wasn't dramatic, just real. One evening in early fall, Rachel and I had dinner with Aunt Carol at a small Italian place downtown. The restaurant was warm and crowded, the air full of garlic and conversation. Carol raised her glass halfway through the meal. To clarity, she said. I smiled. That's a strange toast. It's an underrated one, she replied. Rachel laughed softly. Carol looked at me. How are you really doing? I thought about it for a moment. Better than I expected. Because? Because I stopped trying to hold the whole system together. Carol nodded. Families don't always need someone to hold them together, she said. Sometimes they need someone to stop. I considered that while the waiter cleared our plates. For most of my adult life, I had believed the strongest thing I could do for my family was keep supporting the structure that existed. But the wedding had shown me something different.
Sometimes the moment that looks like exclusion is actually the moment that reveals the role you were playing all along. And once you see that role clearly, you get to decide whether you're still willing to carry it. For the first time in years, I wasn't. And strangely enough, that didn't feel like losing my family. It felt like finally standing outside the story we had all been telling, clear enough to see it for what it was, and calm enough to live differently from that point forward.